In part 1, we explored what geopolitics is and how its imperialist branches operate. In this part, we'll be continuing to dig deeper to uncover the outlines of what Russia's big plan is and what is the thinking behind it. This will help us assess how committed they are to it and what compromises would be sufficient to persuade them to altering the course they have chosen for themselves. If the true goal would be to consolidate the best of what Eurasia has to offer, there could be several alternative paths towards achieving this, and the governing methods to maintain it. But as the attentive reader has learned to expect by now, the might, good, and prosperity of Eurasia is not at all what Dugin is after. It's just an excuse and cover for Russians to try and grab power and steal what others have. Dugin insists that this consolidation of Eurasian power should be led and ultimately controlled by Russians, and that the governing structure of the power consortium should be an empire. He elaborates the necessity of these both at length, which offers the rest of us juicy bits to chew on, and ultimately spit out. Being the good imperialist he is, Dugin admires empires and resents independent nation-states. He considers modern nation-states to be seen as the result of the tragic collapse of traditional empires, and eventually he wants to assimilate them all under one Russian collective. All the political boundaries of Eurasia in the process of building a new empire will be gradually abolished as political boundaries. Russia has tried and failed several times in consolidating and governing large areas. Dugin elaborates the historical shortcomings of earlier Russian governing models, the Tsarist Russia and the USSR, and concludes that both of those failed for fundamental reasons, and that they should not be resurrected as is and used as a basis for orchestrating Eurasian power. Still, he insists that these earlier governing models can be tweaked to make an empire as the best possible governing model for the consolidated Eurasia. Dugin discusses at length Russia's earlier attempts to governing large areas, the Tsarist Russia and the USSR, and concludes that their downfall was caused by three fundamental flaws in their governing models. Firstly, the governing model should not seek to forcefully barricade local or ideological needs, as it will only build pressure for revolutions. Instead, the governing model should be capable to adjust to locally specific needs. Secondly, the practical management of empire cannot be fully centralized to one location. Instead, the governing model should be scalable to allow some practicalities to be cascaded to local control to each sub-empire or smaller region. Finally, and most importantly, he sees that a government that deals only with mundane matters is prone to competing political ideas. Instead, the governing model should control both mundane and spiritual matters to make people more committed to the state even when its policies are not making any sense or if they are in direct contrast with what is good for the society or citizens. Especially, he's paving the way to creating an ideology that can be leveraged to support extreme actions like further expansion wars. In essence, Dugin wants Moscow to be the third and eternal Rome. Observe and see to it, most pious Tsar, that all Christian empires unite with thine own. For two Romes have fallen, but third stands, and fourth there will not be. So, Dugin's urge to include spirituality to the government has nothing ethically higher motivation behind it. It is seen only as a means to an end to solidify Russia's grip on power and to shape a society that can be more easily deployed towards further expansion wars. And what do you know? We are already seeing spirituality being deployed in Russia as an instrument to drive expansionist, imperialist politics. In the event of a bloody conflict, shooting and murder, an appeal to the deeper layers of human psyche is necessary. Fanaticism and sacrifice are necessary. Dugin acknowledges that in the early phase of the empire there will be plenty of resistance by people being forcefully assimilated to it. He seeks to dampen this resistance by awarding higher freedoms and autonomies to the most troubled parts of the empire, but still, at the same time, ensuring that Russia can later unilaterally change the terms of the deal. This he aims to achieve by centralizing and monopolizing military power across all of Eurasia. He reiterates and elaborates throughout the book how this poison pill must be at the very core of the empire, right from the start. The strategic unification of the continent in question should provide control over the sea borders of Eurasia on all sides of the world, continental, economic, industrial, resource autarky, and the centralized management of the Eurasian armed forces. All other aspects of intra-Eurasian integration will be decided on the basis of flexible, differentiated principle depending on each specific case. This empire will be a single and indivisible organism in the military strategic sense, and this will impose political restrictions on all internal sub-imperial formations. All the blocks that will be part of the new empire will be politically limited in one categorical ban on serving the Atlantic geopolitical interest, leaving the strategic alliance and harming continental security. At this, and only at this level, the new empire will be a holistic geopolitical entity. Or, to put it differently, Russia is saying to others that they can do whatever they want as long as Russians have the final say and can take whatever they want whenever they want. And if others don't like what they say or do, the others cannot have the means to stop Russians from enforcing their will. Ultimately, all these promises of autonomies and freedoms are just empty words dampened down to initial resistance of being forced to join Russian Empire. Ultimately, Russia would proceed to unilaterally change the terms of the deal to cripple and damage different parts of the empire to keep them better in control. We will later be coming back to see what this will look like in practice in the areas Russia is already controlling, but which are developing to annoyingly self-sufficient directions. The example of Yakutia will serve as an excellent warning of things to expect. Refill the popcorns. This is where Dugin starts to show first serious signs of unhinging as he seeks to articulate why Russians, of all people, must be the ones to lead all of Eurasia and ultimately the world. He begins moderately by recapping how Abrahamic religions led to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic branches, how Christian branch broke first to Catholic and Orthodox, and then Orthodox further into Moscow and Constantinople-led factions. But in no time at all, he is dismissing all the other ideologies anywhere in the world and claiming that it is the Russians who have the only correct faith and that they have a messianic mission to force their ideology to all others across the world. The Russian people are certainly among the messianic people, and like any messianic people, it has a universal significance that competes not just with other national ideas, but with types of other forms of civilizational universalism. This is not about the unlimited expansion of the living space of the Russians, but about the establishment of a special Russian type of worldview which is accented eschatologically and claims to be the last word in earthly history. This is the supreme super task of the nation as a god-bearing people. The lack of land has never served as the true cause of Russian imperialism. The Russians expanded as carriers of special mission, geopolitical projection of which consisted in a deeper awareness of the need to unite the gigantic territories of the Eurasian continent. Let us have a closer look what exactly this last word in earthly history means. And let's put that into context, shall we? And in a plot twist that surprised absolutely no one, Dugin sees that the only pure and rightful branch, not just among Christians, but among all of the world's religions, is the one that happens to be dominant in the region where he was born. And everyone else has gotten it wrong. So, Russians have a messianic obligation to organize the world according to the religious interpretation that is dominant in Russia-controlled part of the planet. Everyone else will just have to accept that. He then proceeds to remind the reader of the inevitability of the planetary dualism and of the heartland argument, and explicitly refuses to discuss further its legitimacy. Eurasia is predetermined by geographical and strategic unification. This is strictly a scientific geopolitical fact. Russia must inevitably be at the center of such an association. The driving force of the unification is inevitably the Russian people. The civilization mission of Russians, their universalist ideal, and the logic of the historical formation of the nation and the state are in full harmony with this mission. The new empire cannot be any other than the Russian Empire, since both territorially, culturally, civilizationally, and socio-economically and strategically, the Russians naturally and organically correspond to this planetary mission and go to its realization throughout its national and state history. The new Eurasian Empire is inscribed in the geographical and political predetermination of world history and world politics. There is no point in arguing this circumstance. The interests of the Russian people are inseparable from the construction of such a continental structure. Dugin sees that as it is unavoidable destiny that Eurasian power will eventually be consolidated, if Russia does not lead it, someone else will. And if others take the lead initiative, Dugin cannot imagine an outcome where they would not attack Russia. If Russia chooses some other way than the way of gathering the empire, the new powers or blocks of states will begin to take on the heartland continental mission. In this case, the vastness of Russia will be the main strategic goal for those forces that declare themselves to be the new citadel of Eurasia. This is completely inevitable, since control over the continent is inconceivable without control over the space of the geographical axis of history. This new continental integration cannot be avoided, since the geopolitical map of the planet itself resists its unipolar Atlantist orientation. Moreover, the expansion into Russian lands by other Eurasian blocs is prompted not by territorial egoism or Russophobia, but by the implacable logic of space and Russia's geopolitical passivity. In the area of continental strategy, it is foolish to expect other nations to stop territorial expansion in Russian lands only out of the respect for the originality of Russian culture. In order to create a non-Russian Eurasia, it is necessary to completely destroy Russian people. So, Dugin sees that others' passivity in geographic expansion is a sign of weakness and wants Russia to exploit this weakness before they would do to Russia what Russia would like to do to them. And continuing on this theme of expecting others to do to us what we are planning to do to them, it is chilling to the bones to rephrase Dugin's rationale for self-defense and view them as indications of what Russia is planning to do to others. How about stop holding back on the support given to Ukraine? How about taking the gloves off, start giving Ukraine the good stuff, and free hands use them as they see fit, like yesterday? Further on, Dugin elaborates how Russians' national psychological characteristics make them uniquely suitable for the task of consolidating and running Eurasia. Russia, to be the main land power of our time, which inherits the geopolitical mission of Rome, the empire of Alexander the Great, the Genghis Khan, etc. This is the geographical axis of history, which simply cannot but fulfill its geopolitical mission, regardless of external and transient factors. The Russians are the land, continental, North European people, and the cultural specificity of the nation is such that its soul is maximally predisposed to openness, to the implementation of the integrating function, to the subtle and deep process of developing a special continental Eurasian community. Openness, of course, meaning willingness to trigger apocalyptic wars, and integrating function meaning assimilating clearly local civilizations. Seizing the leading role of the planet is the only rightful destiny fitting for such a marvelous group of people. Under correct conditions, only in this way and in no other way can one save the Russian people from political weakness and ethnic degeneration, awaken in all its grandiose volume and for planetary achievements, and finally give it what it really deserves. So Dugin sees that this mindset of not settling for any intermediary compromises makes Russians the natural drivers for Eurasian consolidation. Many Western commentaries on Ukraine war have had difficulties understanding why Russia needs to seek to conquer more land when it already is the biggest country in the world with many underdeveloped territories. Surely they would be better off by utilizing more what they already have, instead of attacking and destroying other countries to gain more land that they would not even use, right? Parallelly, many seem to think that Russia might be appeased by granting them land concessions from Ukraine as a part of peace treaty. Luckily for us, Dugin articulates transparently why these lines of Western thinking are doomed to fail. Russia is not aiming for some amount of land. They want all of it. He argues that for Russians, the building of Eurasian empire is not just an attractive opportunity, but rather that it is an existential necessity. He argues that Russians as a culture and as a nation will cease to exist if it cannot continue to grow indefinitely. The status of a regional power imposed to Russia by the West today is tantamount to suicide. The rejection of the imperial building function means the end of the existence of the Russian people as a historical reality, as a civilizational phenomenon. Such a denial is national suicide. Moreover, inertia, passive following the fatal course of events will not only be destructive for the entire system of continental security, but also fraught with the death of all mankind. The existence of the Russian people directly depends on the continuation of this process, from its development, from its intensification. By cutting or suppressing this vector, we will hit the Russian in the heart, depriving them of their national identity, turning them into a historical rudiment, disrupting the global teleological, eschatological, planetary process. For Russians, the loss of an imperial scale means the end and failure of their participation in civilization, the defeat of their spiritual and cultural value system, the fall of their universalist and messianic aspirations, the depreciation and debunking of the entire national ideology, which revived many generations of the Russian people and gave strength and energy for exploits, creation, struggle, overcoming adversity. The conclusion is obvious. Russia will gradually become drawn into an endless chain of internal conflicts and wars, and in the end will fall apart. This will be a natural result of the Russians losing their imperial mission, since this process cannot be limited to a relative reduction of territories and must necessarily reach its logical limit to the complete destruction of the Russian nation as a historical, geopolitical, and civilizational subject. Outside the empire, the Russians will lose their identity and disappear as a nation. The problem of possible civil war in Russia is becoming more and more urgent. So Dugin argues that the only condition under which Russian culture can continue to exist is when they are working to expand towards somewhere new. Any interruption in this expansion will relieve the perceived external pressure that keeps the Russian society together. And if the external pressure is ever relieved, the Russian society will collapse from within. I know what you're thinking. All this sounds very familiar, doesn't it? I'm positively sure we've encountered something very similar before. If only I could remember where. Oh well, anyway. As a takeaway, it's critically important to understand this line of thinking about the perceived existential necessity of a never-ending imperialist expansion, no matter how flawed or disgusting it is. It is futile to ponder what is Russia's walkaway pain point or maximal costs they can accept in a war of attrition before calling off the attack in Ukraine or beyond. This line of thinking says that Russia is already dead if it stops its imperialist expansion. So, in their mind, there is no reason to compromise, no reason to hold back. No amount of human losses, economic setbacks, or political isolation is too high a price for them to pay if the alternative is to stop and go home. Russia will literally wreck itself back to the Middle Ages, kill off its entire fighting age male demography, and commit any amount of crimes against humanity rather than be forced to face and deal with the fundamental failure points in their societal system. They will not stop proactively. They must be stopped by others. Others can only stop them by force. Let us then move on to recap the high-level game plan that Dugin is painting for Russia. We will be coming back to discuss the more detailed region and country-specific plans in later videos. Russia must first destabilize the existing status quo, where many are annoyingly happily collaborating with the USA. After that, Russia should seek to advance as far as possible without spending their own resources. Instead, Russia should get other useful idiots to do Russia's bidding, and only in very selected places should Russia spend its own resources to finish the conquest, such as Ukraine. Ultimately, nothing short of directly controlling everything is going to be enough for Russia. To achieve this, Dugin is painting a roadmap that is filled with the poison pills that allows Russia to stab its former allies in the back once they have outlived their usefulness. To pave way to Russia's conquest across Eurasia, it's necessary to begin by weakening USA's ability to resist this. In Dugin's mind, this means eradicating USA's perceived beachhead in the mainland sanitary cordon or in the coastal areas, anaconda strategy, which are supposedly used to strangle the Eurasian continent in order to prevent the consolidation of Eurasian power. And most importantly, get that terrifying NATO thing disassembled. Dugin wants only political units of lesser importance to be in the path of Russia's assimilation. Meanwhile, here in the real world, this so-called strangling means providing better economic opportunities and prosperity to countries willing to collaborate constructively with other countries, USA included, than they would be getting by not collaborating. But the ability to provide competitive, more attractive economic opportunities is a game where Russia is weak. So Dugin is inventing terminology that implies that the countries participating in trading would somehow be worse off or exploited in this game, and Russia would have something more appealing to offer. We'll be coming back to the sales pitch Dugin's offering as a carrot to others for joining the empire a bit further down the line. Spoiler warning, it sucks. If Russia would truly want to undermine the political influence that USA achieves alongside its commercial collaboration, it would need to play the same game. Provide a bigger carrot, provide more attractive opportunities to prosper than they are getting by playing ball with the USA. But this is a topic we'll be coming back when we discuss China. But the most important reason for selecting hate and fear as the consolidating impulse is that it aims to create a demand for the one thing Russia would like to bring to the table when consolidating Eurasian power, the demand for military force. It must be infuriating for Dugin to see how little USA is enforcing its interests at gunpoint. The geopolitical construction of this empire should be based on the fundamental principle of common enemy, the denial of Atlanticism, the rejection of the strategic control of the United States, and the rejection of the supremacy of the economic market liberal values. The vast majority of the Eurasian states and peoples perceive American political and strategic influence as an overwhelming burden that alienates nations from their historical fate. Despite all the internal civilizational, religious, and socio-economic differences between the Eurasian powers among themselves, they have a strong and unshakable common denominator: hostility to the totality of Atlantic control. The desire to free oneself from the transatlantic custody of that trade order which the USA is strenuously planting, the stronghold of the marine civilization. And again, translating Duginisms to English, the historical fate from which the nations are alienated means, of course, serving as colonies, slaves, and cannon fodder in a Russia-led empire. The common enemy, Atlanticism, should become the connecting component of the new geopolitical construction. The effectiveness of this factor is beyond doubt, and all arguments against this consideration either naively ignore the objective seriousness of the totality of the Atlantic domination or deliberately divert geopolitical attention from the only responsible and realistic perspective in favor of secondary regional problems that have no solution at all without taking into account the global alignment forces. It is sad, but at the same time very telling, that Dugin does not discuss any other possible goals that could motivate power holders than hate and fear. He does not discuss things like commerce, prosperity, or technology, but instead only focuses on hate and fear. In later parts of the book, it becomes abundantly clear why he has chosen this narrow-minded bias. If the rationale to unify power would be anything more collaborative or constructive, Russia would have a hard time arguing that they are bringing so much value to the table that it would merit them a strong role in the process. And also, focusing on hate and fear enables him to paint a roadmap towards the ultimate goal, which is not making Eurasia the best it can be, but rather enable Russia to exercise its rule over a larger area of land, even if it means ruling over a pile of smoldering, irradiated rubble and ash. Russia cannot bulldoze its way across Eurasia. They simply do not have the muscle to do so. Instead, Dugin's plans to consolidate Eurasian power hinges on the ability to convince other current Eurasian power holders to overlook and abandon their other priorities, and instead proactively fall in line and follow Russia's vision to build, orchestrate, and deploy Eurasian power. Most second-hand commentaries discussing Dugin's book focus on the alliances he proposes Russia should be building towards Berlin, Tokyo, and Tehran. These commentaries paint a picture of positive, constructive, and collaborative approach that Russia would be deploying in the pursuit of bringing the best out of Eurasia and lead it to the brightest possible future. But these commentaries have not been paying attention when reading the book. They have missed the chillingly sinister traps and poison pills embedded in these so-called alliances. Dugin elaborates each of these alliances at length and speaks highly positively of the intended partners. He elaborates the virtues, cultures, histories, and strengths, and in what ways they can complement Russia's capabilities in the pursuit of maximizing Eurasian power. But the attentive reader is left thinking, why these three? Why Berlin, Tokyo, and Tehran? What about, say, Beijing, Paris, or Ankara? Wouldn't they too have something valuable to offer to the pursuit of consolidating the best and most valuable source of power and capability that Eurasia has to offer? We'll be covering these proposed alliances in closer detail in the next section, but here's a quick overview of their commonalities. While Dugin is painting a roadmap where each party can contribute in a way that can be proactively appealing to them, he is at the very same time laying foundations to dispose of these allies once they have outlived their usefulness to Russia. These backstab preparations start already with the selection of these so-called allies. What they all have in common is that Dugin considers them to be regional powers, who do not demonstrate proactive aspirations to challenge Russia on a Eurasian level. In addition, all of these have glaring specific weaknesses that Russia could exploit against them when the need arises. Germany is economic and technological giant, but a military dwarf, so they could simply be overrun with conventional military force. Iran represents a minority branch of Islam, Shiism, which creates an opening for Russia to rally Sunnis against Iran when needed. Japan has a history of behaving in a way that does not facilitate proactive local support in the lands it conquests militarily, which can be exploited against them when the need arises. If the true, honest, primary goal would be to consolidate and maximize Eurasian power, build the most prosperous future, and keep Russian selfish aspirations secondary, natural allies would need to include Paris, Beijing, and Ankara for the absolute very least. But all of these countries have dangers that Dugin wants to mitigate, namely, they all have a recent history of building long-lasting and far-reaching empires of their own, which means they would more likely to demonstrate aspirations to challenge Russia's leading role in Eurasia. They have their own visions on shaping and deploying Eurasian power, so they are less likely to accept a local role and leave Eurasian orchestration to Russia's vision and leadership. They don't have any glaring weakness that could immediately be exploited if conflicting interests began to arise, so it would be preferable to not let them occupy valuable roles in the empire at any stage. Ultimately, all alliances and other nations need to be eradicated, no matter how compliant or cooperative they are towards Russia's goals. In Dugin's mind, any form of collaboration or coexisting is seen as weak and geopolitically unnatural. He keeps iterating and reiterating this idea explicitly throughout the book. Rimlands are necessary for Russia to become a truly sovereign continental geopolitical force. There can simply be no other non-continental sovereignty. Aspiring to achieve anything less than full, direct Russian control of rimlands is seen as political sabotage and working for the benefit of mondialist USA. Only when the coastline becomes southern and western borders of Russia can we talk about the final completion of its continental construction. In the west, Russia should have maritime borders. This is a strategic imperative of the geopolitical development of Eurasia. Eurasia will only be free from sea power when the oceans will become its strategic borders in the north, east, south and west, as is the case of the America. Only then will the duel of civilizations proceed on an equal footing. Especially this last quote is very telling. Russia is not even entertaining the idea of coexisting with their so-called allies, but only using them as stepping stones towards challenging their true archenemy, the thalassocratic US of A. Some of the most chilling parts of the book were the sections where Dugin discusses what would happen once Eurasian power is consolidated and the common enemy, the thalassocratic Atlantist USA, has been driven out from the world island, so that it would not serve as an acute external threat to drive cohesion and justify following Russia-led decisions justified by its military capability. Dugin was worried that Russian influence would begin to diminish and Eurasian power would begin to hinge more from areas where Russia is weak, say technology, economy or prosperity. This is of course unacceptable for Dugin. He wants Russians to have the dominant position in controlling the Eurasian power for all eternity. Plan A, which Dugin discusses with obvious skepticism, would be to create a legislative center that dictates the policies and thus power in all of Eurasia, controlled by Russians of course, because who else could rival their merits and track record in governing and shaping societies? Plan B relies on taking control by force. Throughout the book, he is proposing seemingly subtle preparatory actions that pave the way to overtaking the allies once they have exhausted their usefulness. We will be reviewing these preparations in more detail in upcoming videos, but these include things like setting up military bases beyond Russian lands, offering them land that they will not be able to protect, and volunteering to carry out the unpleasant burdens of building and sustaining all of Eurasia's military power so that the allies would not need to bother with such vulgarities. The question of the Russian state may arise fully, but this refers exclusively to the post-Eurasian period, which in itself is problematic and hypothetical. But already at the present moment, Russians should put all their efforts into national consolidation, spiritual, cultural and religious revival of the people, their final formation and full awakening so that in the future, if necessary, they could defend their national truth not only from enemies but also from allies in imperialism. The Russians do not just have to maintain their identity in the imperial context. They must affirm it, heat it up, deepen it to the utmost. And in the long run, after the collapse of Atlantism, the Russians must be prepared to defend their own civilizational mission, to defend their universal industrial national path. At first, it seems unreasonable to assume that other countries would not immediately see through this plan. However, when looking at post-World War II development in West Europe, it might not be so far-fetched idea to assume that a persistent and patient strategy of lulling others into comfort of peace dividends over decades or even centuries just might work, until Russia sees that others are so weak that they can proceed to change the terms of the deal unilaterally. On some level, we should be thankful that Russia ran out of patience this soon in Ukraine and revealed that their true nature had not changed since time immemorial. If you found the ride so far interesting, make sure to tune in to the next section where we will be picking up further speed by diving deeper into the specific plans Dugin is envisioning Russia should be carrying out in different directions. We'll first start with the most acute active area, West, where Russia is, since Crimea occupation, executing the plan and priorities outlined in Dugin's book that was published in 1997. We'll further explore if we can find other parallels between Dugin's book and real-life actions we are seeing different nations taking.